The wind on the ridge had a sound my grandfather used to name. He called it the long whisper. It came down off the bare shoulder of the mountain in the last hour before, dark, slow, and deliberate, the way an old man tells a story he has told before. I stood on the porch I built with my own 2 hands, and I listened to it, and I felt the iron key in my coat pocket grow warm against my palm. The house behind me smelled of cedar and wood smoke. The valley below me was already turning the color of slate. I was 18 years old when the world handed me a black trash bag and a piece of paper worth $5. They did not know that my grandfather had been preparing for that day for 33 years. They did not know that a quiet man with sawdust under his fingernails had built a fortress out of rust and patience and had left it for a girl who did not yet know her own name. My name is Della Ruth Hollister. This is the story of how I came home. The morning I aged out of the system, the sky over upstate New York was the color of an old nickel. It was the second week of March, and the snow that had fallen in February was still there, only it had stopped being snow. It had become something else, a gray crust along the fence lines, a slush in the gutters that froze again every night and woke up tired every morning. The kind of weather that makes a person feel like the year itself has been forgotten. I was standing on the cracked concrete steps of the Northwood Group home with a trash bag at my feet and a manila envelope in my hand. Inside the bag was everything I owned: 2 pairs of jeans, both worn thin at the knees, 4 t-shirts, a sweatshirt I had stolen from the lost and found bin 2 winters back because no one had come for it, and my own had finally given up, a paperback copy of a novel my mother used to read aloud to me, the spine broken from being opened too many times, and a photograph in a cheap drugstore frame. My mother, my father, my little sister Junie, and me, all of us squinting into the sun at a county fair, all of us holding cones of cotton candy. My grandfather Silas was in the background of that picture, his big carpenter hands resting on Junie's shoulders, his eyes hidden under the brim of a feed cap. I was 9 years old in that photograph. My mother and father would be dead within the year. My grandfather had already been dead for a year. I just did not know it yet. The trash bag weighed almost nothing. The envelope weighed everything. Mrs. Imogene Talbot was my caseworker. She had been my caseworker for the last 6 years. She was a tired woman with tired hair and a tired voice, and she carried a clipboard the way some women carry a Bible, like it was the only thing keeping her on her feet. She came down the steps behind me with the cold breath puffing out of her mouth, and she handed me the bag, and she handed me the envelope, and she said the words she had said to 100 kids before me: "Happy birthday, Della." Her voice was flat. She was not unkind. She was just emptied out. "There's $250 in there. That's your final disbursement. And there's something else, something from the county probate office. It came last week. They asked me to give it to you on your 18th. I looked at her. I waited. "It's from your grandfather," she said. I had not heard that word spoken out loud in 9 years. I did not move. I did not open the envelope. I just stood there on those concrete steps with my breath coming out in white clouds, and I felt the cold seeping up through the soles of my sneakers, and I felt the door behind me click shut. It did not slam. That was the worst part. It clicked, the way a register drawer clicks when an account is closed, the way a chart is filed away. I was officially an adult. I was officially homeless. I turned around and looked at the door because I could not help it. There was a window beside it, a small square window with chicken wire baked into the glass, and behind that window was a face, a small, pale face with brown hair and brown eyes, and the eyes were the same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning, only smaller. My sister Junie was 12 years old. She had her hand flat against the inside of the glass, the fingers spread out like a star. She was not crying. Junie did not cry. Junie was the bravest thing I had ever known. I lifted my own hand. I was going to put it on the glass too. I was going to match her palm to palm the way we used to do when we were little, and our mother would put us to bed in different rooms because we kept whispering. But there were rules at Northwood. There were always rules. No prolonged emotional displays, no goodbyes that the other children might overhear. Goodbyes were disruptive to the routine, so I did not put my hand on the glass. I just looked at her, and she just looked at me, and the single pane of glass between us felt like 100 miles of empty road. I bent down and I picked up the trash bag. I tucked the envelope under my arm. I walked down those concrete steps, and I did not look back, because if I had looked back, I would not have been able to take another step. I would have stood there until I froze to the sidewalk. The bus station was 10 blocks. The wind had a name on the ridge, but here in town, it was just the wind. It came around corners. It found the gap at my throat where the zipper of my jacket would not pull all the way up anymore. It made my eyes water, and I told myself the water in my eyes was from the wind, and I almost believed me. The bus station smelled of disinfectant and bad coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed. An old man slept across 3 chairs with a newspaper folded over his face. A woman in a pink coat was crying quietly into a cell phone in the corner. I sat down on a hard plastic bench, and I set the trash bag between my feet, and I opened the envelope. There was the money. 12 $20 bills and a 10, $250, the total of my 18 years on this earth reduced to a paperclip stack. And there was a letter. The letterhead was old. Thackeray and Sons Attorneys at Law Hollow Ridge, New York. A telephone number with an area code I did not recognize. A street address that sounded like it belonged in a different century. I read the letter 3 times before the words began to mean anything. The man who had written it was named Ambrose Thackeray. He was the executor of a will. The will belonged to my grandfather, Silas Hollister, who had died on a clear October day in 2017 of what the medical examiner had recorded as a sudden cerebral event. I had been 9 years old when it happened. My mother had taken me into the kitchen and sat me down at the table and told me. I remember that her hands had been shaking. I remember that she had not cried in front of me. I remember that 2 months later, my father took a sharp curve on a county road too fast, and that was the end of having parents. The letter said that my grandfather had left me something. It was not money. It was a piece of land. Lot 7B, 2.5 acres of unincorporated parcel in the township of Hollow Ridge, deep in the Catskills. The letter said that in order to claim the deed, I would need to appear in person at Mr. Thackeray's office and settle the back taxes and the transfer fee. The total amount due was specified at the bottom of the page, $5. I looked at the number. I looked at it again. I held the letter up to the buzzing fluorescent light to make sure I was reading it right. $5 for 2.5 acres of land. A slice of pizza in the bus station cost more than that. There was a photograph stapled to the back of the letter. It was a grainy satellite image, a square of darker gray surrounded by lighter gray, and in the middle of that square was a long curved shape, like a loaf of bread had been set down in the middle of a forest. I knew what it was. I had seen them in old textbooks at the group home. A Quonset hut, a piece of military surplus from a war my great-grandfather might have fought in, rusted, forgotten, useless. My first thought was that this was a joke. My second thought was that this was a trap. But my third thought, the one that would not go away, was the memory of my grandfather. He had been a quiet man, a man who built things. He smelled of pipe tobacco and pencil shavings. He taught me how to whittle a piece of pine into a whistle when I was 7 years old. He never raised his voice. He never broke a promise. He was not a man who played jokes. I stood up. My legs felt strange. I walked over to the bank of payphones at the back of the station. I dropped a quarter in the slot. I dialed a number I had memorized 2 years ago, a payphone in the hallway outside the girls' dormitory at Northwood. I knew Junie would be there. We had a system. We had always had a system. She picked up on the second ring. Della? Her voice was very small. It's me, Junebug. It's me. They said you were gone. They said I couldn't talk to you for 30 days. I know what they said. I'm not going to do what they said. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing. I could hear someone laughing in the dorm behind her. A stranger's laugh, the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that did not belong in our story. Where are you? She said. I'm at the bus station. Are you going to the city? No. Where then? I told her about the letter. I tried to make it sound like an adventure. I told her about Grandpa Silas and the lawyer and the land in the mountains. I told her there was a building on it, a real building, made of metal, sturdy. Like a house, she asked. Sort of. Does it have a roof? I almost laughed. I almost cried. I held the phone tighter. Junebug, it's pretty much all roof. She was quiet for a long moment. I could picture her face, the little furrow between her eyebrows when she was thinking hard. She got that from our father. Are you going to be there? She asked. All by yourself. For a little while, just for a little while. And then I closed my eyes. The fluorescent light hummed. The woman in the pink coat was still crying in the corner. And then I'm going to fix it up. I'm going to make it a home. And then I'm coming for you. I promise. You promise. I promise. It was the kind of promise an 18-year-old girl with $250 and a trash bag should not have made. The law was not on my side. The system was not on my side. The mountain itself was not on my side. But I made the promise anyway because she needed to hear it, and because I needed to say it, and because some promises become true only after you have said them out loud. I love you, Della. I love you, Junebug. Be brave. The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a wasp. I stood there with the receiver in my hand for a long time before I hung up. When I turned back to the platforms, there were 2 buses idling. One was bound for the city, the headlights yellow in the gray afternoon. The other had a destination scroll that listed a string of small mountain towns, and one of them near the bottom of the scroll was Hollow Ridge. I walked to the ticket window. I bought a one-way ticket to a town I had never seen. I spent $23.75 of my $250. It was the most reckless thing I had ever done. It was the first real choice anyone had let me make in 6 years. The ride into the mountains took 4 hours. The bus climbed. The valleys deepened. The towns we passed through grew smaller and smaller, and the gas stations grew further and further apart, and the trees grew older and taller, and the sky grew lower and closer. I sat by a window with my forehead against the cold glass, and I watched the world I had known fall away behind me. By the time the bus pulled into Hollow Ridge, the sun was a thin, pale disk behind the western ridge, and there were only 3 of us left on board: an old farmer with a feed cap, a woman with a paper grocery sack, and me with my trash bag and my envelope and a $5 bill folded in my front pocket where I could feel it against my hip. The main street of Hollow Ridge looked like a postcard that had been left out in the rain. The buildings were brick and stone. The signs were faded: a diner with a neon coffee cup, a barber shop with a striped pole that no longer turned, a feed store, a hardware store with a wooden sign that read Rinaldi and Son in letters that had been painted over more than once, a church at the far end with a white steeple and a bell that I would later learn had not rung since the year of my mother's wedding. The town did not look forgotten. It looked like it was waiting for someone. The office of Ambrose Thackeray, Esquire, was on the 2nd floor over a pharmacy. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and the moment I caught that second smell, I had to stop and put my hand on the wall, because my grandfather had smelled like that, and I had not smelled that smell in 9 years, and a thing inside my chest that I thought had calcified turned out to still be soft enough to bleed. I knocked on the door at the end of the hall. A voice that sounded like dry leaves said, "Come in, Miss Hollister." He had not asked who I was. He had known. Ambrose Thackeray was 80 if he was a day. He sat behind a mahogany desk that was older than he was. His beard was neatly trimmed and white as new snow. His glasses sat low on his nose. He wore a tweed jacket with leather patches at the elbows, and he had a fountain pen in his hand, the way another man might have held a cigarette. The wall behind him was lined with leather books that had not been moved in decades. Above the books was a photograph in a black frame, but it was too high and too dim for me to make out. He stood up when I came in. He held out his hand. His grip was light and dry and very, very firm. "Your grandfather described you to me once, Miss Hollister. He said you had your mother's eyes and your grandmother's chin. He was right on both counts." I could not speak. He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. He sat. He folded his hands on the desk. Mr. Hollister came to this office in the autumn of 1993. He had certain instructions. The instructions were specific and they were precise, and he did not deviate from them in any of the 24 years he was alive after that. The instructions were that on your 18th birthday, and only on your 18th birthday, the property in question was to be offered to you, and to you alone, for the sum of the outstanding taxes and the transfer fee. That sum, as of today, is $5. I took the $5 bill out of my front pocket. I unfolded it. I smoothed it flat on the surface of his desk. The bill was old. The picture of Abraham Lincoln was wrinkled at the edge. Mr. Thackeray looked at the bill. He did not pick it up. He slid a stack of papers across the desk and pointed to 2 lines with a bony finger. I signed. My signature looked like a child's. My hand was shaking. He took the papers back. He stamped one of them with a seal. He put a second stamp under the first. He set the papers aside. Then he leaned back in his chair, and the chair groaned, and he looked at me over the tops of his glasses. "Now, Miss Hollister, we must speak of certain matters. Your grandfather purchased this land in 1993. It was cheap then, and it is not worth a great deal more now. The parcel has no road access. It has no well, no septic, no electrical service. There is a derelict military surplus structure on it that has not been maintained in any meaningful way for at least 3 decades. In short, it is a piece of wilderness with a metal can on it." He paused. There is, however, another option. I looked up. I received an inquiry last Tuesday. A development company in Albany. They are part of a larger holding. They are buying up parcels in this area. They have offered in writing the sum of $5,000 for the deed to your land, as is, sight unseen, $5,000. I felt the number land in my chest like a slow stone dropped into a deep well. It was a fortune. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was a lawyer's retainer to begin the fight for Junie. It was groceries for a year and bus tickets and warm coats and a phone bill and a chance. I thought of Junie's small hand against the glass. I thought of the rules at Northwood. I thought of how a smart girl, a sane girl would say yes. "Who are they?" I said. Mr. Thackeray did not blink. They called themselves Summit Creek Estates. They claimed to be planning a resort, a golf course perhaps, a retreat. The principal is a man named Roland Pickering. His son Trevor is their counsel. He paused. He watched my face. He was looking for something. They have been very persistent, Miss Hollister. 5,000 was their opening figure. I want you to understand that. It is what they thought a desperate young woman just out of foster care would accept without asking questions. It is an insult dressed up as an opportunity. The choice, however, is yours and yours alone. I sat in that chair in that quiet office over the pharmacy in Hollow Ridge, New York, and I thought about my grandfather. I thought about a quiet man with sawdust on his sleeves who had walked into the same office in the autumn of 1993 and had given an old lawyer a set of instructions and had not deviated from those instructions for the rest of his life. He had wanted me to come here. He had wanted me to choose. I lifted my chin. I felt my grandmother's chin set the way I had been told it was always set the way my mother's had been set in the photograph at the county fair. I'm not selling. The words came out before I knew I had decided. Mr. Thackeray's eyebrows lifted, just a fraction, a small flicker that was not quite a smile, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of one. "Are you certain, Miss Hollister?" "Yes, sir. $5,000 is in your present circumstance not an insubstantial sum." "No, sir, it isn't. But it isn't enough." He looked at me for a long moment. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked. The radiator hissed. "Your grandfather," he said at last very quietly, "would be pleased." He reached into the top drawer of his desk, and he took out an iron key. It was heavy. It was old. It was the kind of key a person could not lose, the kind that took up space in a coat pocket, the way a small animal might take up space with a presence with a weight. The key was covered in a fine layer of rust. He set it on the desk between us. He set a piece of folded paper beside it, a hand-drawn map on what looked like the same yellowed stock as the deed. "This key opens the padlock on the structure. Mr. Hollister left it with me when he made his arrangements. The map will guide you the rest of the way. The hike from the county road is approximately 1/2 of a mile. I suggest you set out at first light tomorrow and not this evening. The dark comes down very quickly in the hollows." I picked up the key. The weight of it surprised me. It felt warm somehow in my palm, though it had been sitting in a cold drawer. I was about to stand up. He reached into the drawer again. He took out a second envelope. It was thick. It was heavy. It was sealed with a smear of dark wax, the wax pressed with a thumbprint that was not Mr. Thackeray's. The envelope was addressed in a handwriting I had not seen in 9 years, but which I would have known in the dark, with my eyes closed, in a room full of strangers, for my granddaughter, Della Ruth Hollister, to be opened only after her first night on the land. Mr. Thackeray slid the envelope across the desk. He was very specific about this, Miss Hollister. You are not to open it until you have spent your first night in the structure, he said, and I am quoting his exact words because I wrote them down at the time. Tell her to leave it alone until the sun has come up on her first morning. Tell her she needs to know she is strong enough first. Tell her the envelope is for the girl she will be by then, not the girl she is when you hand it to her. I took the envelope. I held it in my hands. The wax seal was rough under my thumb. The handwriting blurred for a moment, and I blinked and it sharpened again. He said one more thing, Mr. Thackeray added. He said, do not let her think the puzzle is over when she gets to the hut. Tell her the hut is only the beginning. I looked up at the old lawyer. I did not yet understand what those words meant. I would understand them soon, but not yet. Not in that warm office over the pharmacy with the grandfather clock ticking and the radiator hissing and the sealed envelope heavy in my hands. Mr. Thackeray stood. He came around the desk. He walked me to the door. At the door he stopped, and he put a hand very lightly on my shoulder. His fingers were like bird bones. Miss Hollister, he said, you will not be alone in this. Do you understand me? Whatever else you may be told, whatever else you may come to believe, you will not be alone. I nodded. I did not know yet how much I would need to remember he had said that. The county road outside Hollow Ridge ran for 3 miles through a corridor of bare maples and white pines. The sky had gone the color of bruise. The slush along the shoulder was beginning to refreeze, and my breath was coming out in long plumes, and the trash bag over my shoulder felt heavier with every step. I had eaten a single donut at the diner and drunk a cup of black coffee that had cost me $1.25. The $5 bill was gone. The $250 was now $223.50, and the iron key was in my coat pocket, and the sealed envelope was inside the lining of my jacket, where I could feel its corners every time I shifted my shoulders. Old Miller Road, when I finally found it, was not a road at all. It was a suggestion. 2 muddy ruts disappearing into a tangle of birch and pine. The map said half a mile. The map did not say uphill. The map did not say through. By the time I came to the line of crumbling stone walls that marked the corner of Lot 7B, the sun had dropped behind the ridge, and the woods were beginning to turn from gray to blue to a deeper blue, and the air had the bone-deep cold of a place where no one had built a fire in a very long time. I climbed over the wall. I pushed through a tangle of bare thorn bushes, and there it was, the Quonset hut. It squatted in a small clearing like an animal that had given up. The shape of it was beautiful in its way, a long, low curve, a semicircle laid down on the earth, but the skin of it was something else entirely. Rust bloomed across the corrugated steel in great orange continents. The seams between the panels were dark with weather. A few small windows were set high up along the curve, and one of them had been broken and patched with what looked like a license plate. At the far end of the structure, a stovepipe leaned out of the roof at a crooked angle like a finger pointing at the sky. The huge double doors at the front were chained shut. The chain was the color of dried blood. The padlock that held the chain was the size of a man's fist. My heart, which had been beating very fast on the climb, slowed. This was it. This was what I had traded the city for. This was what I had said no to $5,000 for. This was the inheritance my grandfather had built 33 years of his life around. I almost laughed. I almost sat down in the dirt and cried. I did neither. I walked up to the doors. I took the iron key out of my pocket. I fitted it into the padlock. The key resisted. The pins inside the lock had not been turned in a very long time. I leaned my shoulder against the door, and I twisted the key with both hands, and for a long moment I thought it was the wrong key, that the whole journey was a final cosmic joke, and then there was a deep grinding sound, a metal on metal scream, and the lock fell open in my hand. The chain slithered to the ground with a heavy clang that echoed against the curved metal walls and bounced back at me from the trees. I put both my hands on the right-hand door, and I pulled. It groaned. It fought me. Then it gave. A wedge of dim light fell across the floor of the hut. The air that came out of the doorway smelled of damp earth and old iron and something else, something fainter, something I could not name yet, but which I would later learn was the smell of a place where a man had once spent a great deal of time waiting. I stepped inside. The interior of the hut was a cavern. It was bigger on the inside than it looked from the outside. The arch of the ceiling rose into shadows. A single crack in the roof near the back let in a thin pencil of late gray light, and that light fell across a floor of poured concrete that was rough and uneven and the color of bone. There was almost nothing in the hut. A workbench along one wall, a few rusted tools hanging from nails, a wood-burning stove in the back corner, squat and black with the chimney pipe rising up to the leaning vent in the roof, a pile of canvas tarps folded on top of a wooden pallet, a coffee can full of nails on the workbench, a coiled rope on a hook, and nothing else. I stood in the middle of that vast curved space, and I listened. Outside, the wind whispered down off the ridge. Inside, my own heartbeat, a drip of water somewhere I could not see, the settling of metal as it cooled. I dragged a tarp down off the pallet. I unfolded it on the concrete floor near the stove. I dragged a second tarp on top of it. I sat down on the makeshift bed. I pulled my knees up under my chin. I wrapped my arms around my own shins. I did not cry. I did not eat. I did not sleep for a long time. I sat in the dark and I listened to the long whisper coming down off the ridge, and I held the sealed envelope against my chest, and I waited for the sun. When sleep finally took me, it took me without warning, the way sleep takes a person who has been running on adrenaline for too many hours. I dreamed of my mother. I dreamed of the kitchen table where she had told me my grandfather was dead. I dreamed of Junie's small hand on the glass. I dreamed of a man with sawdust on his sleeves walking up a mountain road in the autumn of 1993 with a piece of paper in his pocket and a long, slow plan in his heart. I woke when the sun came in through the crack in the roof. It did not come in soft. It came in like a spotlight, a single beam of dawn-light pale gold, sharp edge falling at an angle through the dust of the rafters. It moved as I watched it, the way the sun moves across a clock face, slow and certain, and it traveled along the floor of the hut until it stopped. It stopped on a wooden crate. The crate was small, it was square, it was made of dark weathered planks with rope handles on the sides. It was sitting in the exact center of the curved interior of the Quonset hut. I had not seen it the night before. The dim light had not reached it. The shadows had hidden it. But now in the morning, with that single beam of gold falling on it like a stage light in an empty theater, it looked like the only thing in the world. I got up. My back hurt. My breath was a white cloud. I walked to the crate. There was no lid. Inside, packed in straw, were glass jars, mason jars, the kind a person uses for canning. Each one was sealed with a wax-dipped lid. There were 12 of them. They were neatly arranged. They looked like preserves on a shelf in a cellar. I knelt down. I lifted one of the jars out of the straw. It was too heavy to be peaches. It was too heavy to be beans. I held it up to the beam of dawn light. The light caught the glass and the contents and made them glow. The jar was full of money, bundles of bills rolled tight, held with rubber bands that had gone brittle with time. 20s, 50s, hundreds, old bills soft and worn, the kind of bills that came out of a coffee can or a sock drawer, or the cracked palm of a man who did not believe in banks for the most important things. I sat down. I sat down hard. The concrete was cold under me. I did not feel it. I peeled the wax off the jar with my thumb. I twisted the lid. The lid came loose with a soft pop. I pulled one of the bundles out. The rubber band crumbled in my fingers, and a small fall of $20 bills cascaded into my lap. I counted the bundle. $1,000. I looked at the jar. There were at least 20 bundles in that jar. I looked at the crate. There were 12 jars in the crate. I did the arithmetic. I did it twice. I did not believe it the first time. I did not entirely believe it the second time. This was not a head start. This was a life. This was Junie's life. I sat on that cold concrete floor in the rusted hut at the top of an empty road in the middle of the Catskills, surrounded by a fortune I had been told for 18 years did not exist for girls like me, and I started to laugh. The laugh was strange. It came out of my mouth in a sound I had not heard come out of myself before. It echoed off the curved metal walls, and the curved metal walls threw it back at me, and the laugh turned into a sob, and the sob turned into a flood, and I sat there in the beam of dawn light, and I cried for everything. I cried for the 6 years at Northwood. I cried for the night my mother had told me about Grandpa Silas, and her hands had shaken, and she had not let me see her cry. I cried for the curve of the county road that had killed my father. I cried for the donut and the coffee in the diner, and for the $23.75, and for the $250 in the envelope, and for the woman in the pink coat in the bus station. I cried for Junie's hand on the glass. And then, when I was empty of crying, when the dawn light had moved off the crate and onto the wall, I wiped my face on my sleeve, and I reached into the lining of my jacket, and I took out the sealed envelope. The wax was brittle. It broke when I pressed my thumb against it. Inside the envelope was a stack of pages and a smaller envelope and a photograph. I lifted the photograph out first. It was a black and white print square with the soft, scalloped edges of a snapshot from an older world. The corners were a little curled. The image was sharp. 2 men stood in a clearing on the side of a mountain. They were young. They were maybe 25 years old. They wore the rough clothes of men who worked outside. Heavy boots, dungarees, flannel shirts. One of them held a folded survey map. The other had a transit on a tripod beside him and a hand on the back of the first man's neck, the way a brother might hold a brother. The man on the right was my grandfather. I had not seen him in 9 years, but his eyes were the eyes I had been looking at over a kitchen table when I was 7 years old, learning how to whittle a piece of pine into a whistle. They were kind eyes. They were a little tired. They were eyes that had already seen something they could not tell me about. The man on the left was a stranger. He was tall. He was lean. He had a sharp jaw and a sharper smile and a gold ring on his left hand that caught the sunlight where the photographer had captured it. He was looking not at the camera, but at my grandfather, and there was an expression on his face that I could not quite name. It was almost affection. It was almost something else. I turned the photograph over. There were 3 lines of handwriting on the back. The handwriting was my grandfather's. Silas Hollister and Cyrus Pickering, Catskill Geological Survey, July 1992. Below that, in a different ink in a hand that had been written in a different year by a man who had grown older and harder in the meantime, were the words, "This is Cyrus Pickering. Do not trust his son. Do not trust his grandson. Especially do not trust his grandson." I read the words. I read them again. The name was familiar. The name had been spoken in a warm office over a pharmacy not 24 hours earlier. Roland Pickering. His son Trevor is their counsel. The development company, the $5,000. The insult dressed up as an opportunity. This was not a coincidence. This was not a real estate transaction. This was something else. This was a thread that ran back into the summer of 1992, into a clearing on a mountainside, into the friendship of two young men with a survey map and a transit, and whatever had passed between them in the years that followed had become the reason I was sitting in a rusted Quonset hut at the age of 18 with a fortune in mason jars and a sealed envelope and a key that had not been turned in a generation. I did not know yet what had happened between those two men. I did not know yet that my grandfather had made a mistake in the autumn of 1992 that would mark him for the rest of his life. I did not know yet that the mistake had bought me my home. I sat in the empty hut with the photograph in my hand and the dawn light climbing the curved wall, and I understood for the first time that I had not been left a piece of property. I had been left a war. I packed the photograph and the pages and the smaller envelope back into the larger one. I wrapped the larger one in a piece of canvas. I climbed down a short way from the hut to a place where a fallen birch made a hollow under its roots, and I tucked the bundle deep into the hollow, and I covered the hollow with leaves and a flat stone. I did the same with 11 of the 12 jars in the crate. I left one jar inside hidden under a tarp in a far corner. I took $200 out of the one jar. I put the money in my front pocket where the $5 bill had been the night before. I closed the great double doors. I wrapped the chain around the handles. I snapped the padlock shut. I walked back down Old Miller Road in the morning light. The slush had refrozen overnight. My breath came in plumes. The county road stretched ahead of me toward town. The sky was clearer than it had been the day before. There were birds in the maples. There were tracks of deer in the snow along the shoulder. In town, I went first to the hardware store with the wooden sign that read, "Rinaldi and Son." A bell tinkled when I pushed open the door. The store smelled of motor oil and oiled wood and cold steel and something else, something deeper, something that smelled like the inside of my grandfather's workshop when I was 7 years old. A man stood behind the counter. He was in his 60s. He was big in the chest and the shoulders with hands like shovels and a face like a weathered fence post. He wore a green apron over a flannel shirt. His hair was gray, cut short. His eyes were small and quick and not unkind. He looked up when the bell rang. He looked at me. He looked at me for a long second. He set down the wrench he had been polishing. He put both his hands flat on the counter. He did not smile. He did not frown. He just looked. "Hollister," he said. His voice was low. It was not a question. It was a recognition. I nodded. He nodded back slowly once. "Knew your granddaddy," he said. "Long time ago. You got his chin." He did not say anything else for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and brought out a brown paper sack. He set the sack on the counter. He pushed it across to me. "Coffee's on the burner and back. Sit a minute, child. We got things to talk about, you and me, and we got a lot of work to do." Outside, the long whisper came down off the ridge. inside the bell over the door went still. I sat down on a wooden stool by the counter, and I took the sack of coffee, and I looked at the man whose name I did not yet know, and I understood that the war I had been left had two sides, and that I was not after all going to fight it alone. His name was Buford Rinaldi. Everyone in Hollow Ridge called him Buck. He pushed a mug of black coffee across the counter to me, and he poured a second one for himself, and he stood there in his green apron with his big hands wrapped around the cup, the way a man wraps his hands around a small fire. He did not speak right away. He let me drink. He let me feel the warmth of it in my chest. He watched me the way a man watches a deer at the edge of a tree line, with patience, with respect, with a quiet attention that did not feel like staring. When I had drunk half the cup, he set his own cup down on the counter. Your granddaddy and me, we put up a barn together in the fall of '78. 100-foot pole barn out on the Renner place. He could read a roof line the way some men read a Bible. He'd squint up at it and tell you which rafter was a quarter-inch off, and he'd be right every time. He stopped. He took another sip of his coffee. He talked about you, child, about both of you, the girls he called you. He had a picture in his wallet, county fair, cotton candy. He showed it to me one Christmas Eve in this very store, and he said, "Those are my girls, Buck. Those are my girls." I could not speak. I just held the cup. He died too quick, Buck said. Some folks die slow, and some die quick, and there's an order to how a man's affairs are supposed to settle. He went quick, and his affairs did not settle the way he'd have wanted them to. Your folks, too. I was sorry for it. I am sorry for it. He looked down at his hands. I didn't know where they sent you and your sister. I asked. I drove to the county seat. I asked the woman at the desk. She said it was sealed. She said it was none of my concern. His jaw moved a little. It was my concern, but the law don't always know what's whose concern. He looked up at me. You walking up here yesterday with a trash bag and that old envelope. I figured it out the second you came through that door. You got his chin, child. You got her eyes, the mother's eyes. There ain't no way to miss it. I set down the cup. I asked him the question I had not been able to ask Mr. Thackeray because I had not yet known to ask it. Mr. Rinaldi, Buck, sir, who is Cyrus Pickering? The change in his face was small. He did not flinch. He did not look away, but something inside the man went very, very still, the way a pond goes still before a storm. Where did you hear that name? My grandfather left me a picture. He looked at me for a long second, then he nodded. Come on into the back. We'll talk in the back. The back of Rinaldi's hardware was a workshop. It smelled of pine shavings and gun oil. A wood stove burned in the corner. A radio on a shelf was playing a country station so low it sounded like a memory of music. He gestured to a stool. I sat. He sat across from me on an upturned 5-gallon bucket, and he set his cup on the workbench between us, and he laced his thick fingers together. Your granddaddy worked for the state in the early '90s, he said. Geological survey. They were mapping the whole western Catskills, looking for water mostly, some minerals but mostly water. The state was thinking ahead. They knew the city was going to keep growing. They knew water was going to be the thing. He paused. Silas had a partner on that survey. Young fella, sharp as a new tack, same age. They'd been to school together. Some folks said they were close as brothers. Some folks said closer. The partner's name was Cyrus Pickering. He looked at me. Cyrus was from old money in Albany, the kind of family that had a name on a building. He didn't have to work for the state. He did it because he loved the work. Or, that's what he said. Some folks said he did it because his daddy wanted him out of the way for a couple of years, see if the boy could grow into something. He had a wife, he had a baby boy, year or two old at the time. Roland, the name hit me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. They surveyed this ridge in the summer of '92, Buck said. I remember it because Silas drank coffee in this very store that whole summer. He'd come in for nails and he'd stay for an hour. He was happy that summer. He was doing work he was made for. He stopped. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. That fall, Cyrus Pickering died. I did not say anything. He fell, Buck said, off a ridge not 3 miles from where your hut sits. They said it was an accident. They said he'd been hiking alone, and he slipped on wet leaves, and that was the end of it. There was an inquest. The sheriff at the time was a man named Hollenbeck. Big man. Drank a little. He signed off on it. Accidental death. Did people believe it? I said. He looked at me. His small, quick eyes were very steady. Most people did, child. Most people did. He did not say what the rest of the people thought. He did not have to. What does it have to do with my grandfather? Silas was the last person to see Cyrus alive. They'd gone up the ridge together to verify a survey point. Cyrus didn't come back down. Silas came down, white as a sheet, and he told the sheriff what had happened, and the sheriff wrote it down, and that was the end of it, as far as the law was concerned. He paused. It wasn't the end of it for your granddaddy. I waited. He was never the same after that fall, child. I'm not going to lie to you. He drank for a couple of years. He stopped going up on roofs. He stopped working for the state. He went into carpentry full time, just framing and trim, nothing high. He married your grandmother in '94. He bought that lot up on Old Miller Road in '93, and he wouldn't ever explain to anyone, not even your grandmother, may she rest, why he'd paid good money for a piece of dirt that didn't have a road to it. He picked up his cup. He drank. The Pickering family didn't take kindly to the inquest. They thought there was more to the story. Old Mr. Pickering, Cyrus's daddy, he came up here in the spring of '93, and he stood on the main street, and he said to anyone who would listen that the state of New York had let his son's killer walk free. He named your grandfather by name on this street, in front of the diner. I was standing in this doorway when he said it. He looked at me to make sure I was hearing him. He didn't have proof. He just had a grief that big can wear a man down to the bone. And then he went home to Albany. He died of a heart attack 2 years later. The boy Roland grew up. He had his daddy's grief and his granddaddy's money, and he never let go of any of it. He started buying up land in this county about 10 years ago, quietly, through shells. We didn't always know it was him. Buck set the cup down. 3 years ago, his company made an offer on your granddaddy's parcel. Silas told him to go to hell. I felt something cold begin in my spine and travel down into my legs. 2 months after that, your granddaddy was dead. I did not breathe. They called it a stroke, Buck said. The medical examiner signed off on it. Hollow Ridge isn't a place where people ask hard questions. Child, we're a small town. We don't have the resources. We don't have the press. We don't always have the stomach for it. He looked down at his hands. I had my own suspicions. I went to the new sheriff, Earl Hollenbeck, the old sheriff's boy. Earl listened to me. Earl said he'd look into it. Earl never got back to me. He looked up. I should have pushed harder. I want you to know that. I should have pushed harder, and I didn't, and your granddaddy is in the ground because I didn't. So you tell me what you need, child. You tell me what you need, and I will put my hand on it. I sat on the stool in the back of the hardware store with a cooling cup of coffee in my hand, and I looked at a man I had met 15 minutes ago, and I understood that he was the second oldest piece of the puzzle my grandfather had left for me. The first piece was the Iron Key. The second piece was Buford Rinaldi. There would be other pieces. I could feel them already in the air around me the way a person can feel a coming rain. I need lumber, I said, and nails, and a sleeping bag, and a propane stove, and I need to know everything you know about Cyrus Pickering's grandson. Buck looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled for the first time since I had walked into his store, and the smile changed his whole face. "Child," he said, "you do have his chin." I lived in the Quonset hut through the rest of March and into the green edge of April, and the days fell into a rhythm that was so different from anything I had ever known that I sometimes forgot for whole hours at a stretch that I had spent 6 years inside a building with a wire mesh window. The cold was hard. The work was harder. I learned to split kindling with a hatchet. I learned to feed the wood stove the way Buck had shown me, with the damper open at first, to draw a fire, then close down to let the coals do their slow work. I learned to haul water from the stream a quarter-mile down the slope, 2 5-gallon buckets at a time, and to ration it for cooking and washing, and the small enamel basin I use for my face every morning. I patched the hole in the roof with a tarp lashed to the rafters with parachute cord. I cleared the brush from around the foundation with a swing blade Buck loaned me out of his own tool shed. I cleaned the wood stove with a wire brush and a can of stove polish, and I lit a real fire in it on the 3rd night, and the warmth that spread through the curve of the hut made me feel for the first time in my life that I had a roof of my own over my head. I called Junie from the payphone outside the diner every Wednesday and every Sunday. I told her about the work. I told her about the trees. I told her about the deer that had come to the edge of the clearing one morning and stared at me with its long ears tipped forward. I did not tell her about the jars in the crate. I did not tell her about the photograph. I did not tell her about Cyrus Pickering. "You sound different, Della," she said one Sunday the 2nd week of April, when the snow had finally started to give up along the south-facing slopes. "Different how?" "I don't know. Older, less scared." "I am scared, Junebug." "It doesn't sound like it. It's a good kind of scared now." There was a long pause. The line crackled. "Mrs. Talbot says I can't see you for 6 months, Junie said. She said even if you came to visit, they wouldn't let me out." "I know. We're gonna fix that." "How?" "I'm working on it, Junebug. I promise." I did not yet know how. I knew only that the answer was somewhere in the puzzle. My grandfather had left, and that I had not yet found all the pieces. On a Tuesday in the middle of April, I came down to the post office in town to pick up my general delivery, which I had set up the week before, and there was a single envelope in my slot. It was thick. It was creamy. It was embossed in the corner with a stylized mountain peak in dark green ink. The return address was a law firm in Albany. I opened it standing at the counter. The offer had been raised to $25,000. The language had also been raised. The letter explained in the courteous tones of a viper that Summit Creek Estates was prepared to take steps to acquire the property by other means should I prove unable to reach a sensible accommodation. The words eminent domain appeared in the 2nd paragraph. The phrase unimproved structure constitutes a blight upon the surrounding parcels appeared in the 3rd. The letter was signed by Trevor Pickering, Esquire, Senior Counsel. I read it twice. I folded it and I put it in my coat. I drove out to Mr. Thackeray's office. He had a Buick from the late 80s that he kept in pristine condition, and he had loaned it to me without ceremony after my 2nd visit. He had said only An attorney's car ought to do something useful in the world, Miss Hollister. I had not known what to say to that. I had simply taken the keys. Mr. Thackeray read the letter. He set it down. He took off his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief. They are escalating, he said. They are also bluffing on the eminent domain question. A private developer cannot invoke eminent domain. They are hoping you don't know that. They are hoping you will be frightened. I am frightened. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses. You are not so frightened, Miss Hollister, that you would mistake fright for surrender. I can see that from across this desk. He set the glasses back on his nose. There is another thing. I want you to do something for me. I want you to go to the county clerk's office in Kingston and request a copy of your grandfather's death certificate. I want you to look at the date of issue. I want you to look at the cause of death. And I want you to ask the clerk very politely whether there is a record of any appointments your grandfather may have had on his calendar in the week of his passing. I looked at him. Why? Because Buford Rinaldi telephoned me yesterday evening, he said, and Buford is a thorough man, and he believes you should know what he knows, and I agree with him. I drove the Buick to Kingston the next morning. The clerk was a woman in her 50s with a cardigan and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She was kind. She pulled the file. She made the copies. The death certificate listed the cause of death as a cerebral vascular event. The date was October 11th, 2017. I had been 9 years old. I asked the clerk very politely if there was a way to find out what my grandfather had on his calendar that week. She looked at me over her glasses. Well, hon, that wouldn't be in our records, but the sheriff's office would have his personal effects from the death scene. Sometimes there's a date book you could ask. I thanked her. I drove to the sheriff's office. I asked for the personal effects of Silas Hollister, deceased October 11, 2017. The deputy at the desk gave me a look that was not unfriendly, but was not friendly either. He went into the back. He came out 20 minutes later with a brown paper bag sealed with tape, my grandfather's name printed on the side in black marker. I signed for the bag. I drove out of the parking lot. I pulled over at the first turnoff. I cut the tape with my pocket knife. I opened the bag. Inside was a wallet, a pocket knife, a handkerchief, a set of keys, a pencil with the tip broken, and a small spiral-bound date book, the kind a carpenter might keep in his shirt pocket. I opened the date book to the week of October 11th, 2017. There were notes in my grandfather's handwriting, estimates, phone numbers, a reminder to pick up roofing nails, and on October 12th, the day after he died, there was a single line underlined twice. 10 a.m. Howard Massengill, Times Union. He says he is ready. I sat in the Buick on the shoulder of a county road in the cold spring sunlight, and I looked at that line, and I read the name 3 times, Howard Massengill of the Albany Times Union. A reporter. My grandfather had been scheduled to meet a newspaper reporter at 10 o'clock in the morning on the day after he died. He had died the night before. I closed the date book. I drove back to Hollow Ridge slowly. I did not speed. I did not weep. I kept my hands at 10 and 2, the way Buck had taught me when he gave me my first driving lesson in the parking lot behind the hardware store, and I let the truth of what I had just learned settle in my chest the way a stone settles to the bottom of a deep pond. My grandfather had not died of a stroke. My grandfather had been killed for what he was about to say. I went back to the hut that night. I did not eat. I sat on the floor by the wood stove with the date book in my hands. I thought about the long whisper coming down off the ridge. I thought about a man on a mountainside in October of 1992 with his partner beside him and a survey map in his pocket. I thought about a different man alone in a workshop somewhere dialing a reporter's number after 25 years of silence, and the courage that must have taken and the price that had been paid for it. In the morning, I went back into the hut with a broom and a hard scrub brush, and I cleaned the concrete floor. I cleaned it inch by inch. I cleaned it from the front doors to the back wall. I cleaned around the wood stove and along the workbench and into the corners. I worked on my hands and knees. The concrete had been poured a generation ago, and it was cracked in places and stained in others, but it was solid. It was deliberate. It was my grandfather's letter, had said the key. I read the letter again that night. The letter had been folded in the larger envelope with the photograph, and it was written on yellowed lined paper in the same neat carpenter's hand. It was not a long letter. It said the things a quiet man would say to a granddaughter he loved and could not protect. It said the money was for me and Junie. It said the land was for us too. It said that what was on the land was less important than what was under it, and in the last paragraph underlined twice the same way the entry in the date book had been underlined twice, it said, "The foundation is the key, child. Everything starts with the foundation. Look where the light cannot reach." I had looked. I had been looking for 3 weeks. I had not yet found it. That night I lay on my cot with the wood stove ticking, and I thought about the way the morning light came in through the crack in the roof and the way the beam moved across the floor as the sun climbed. The crate had been placed exactly where the light fell at dawn. My grandfather had not done that by accident. My grandfather had not done anything by accident. Look where the light cannot reach. I sat up. The beam of dawn light fell on a particular spot on the floor. That spot was lit briefly every clear morning, but the rest of the day the wood stove cast a long, deep shadow into the far back corner. That corner was the darkest part of the hut. I had been keeping a wheelbarrow there, a pile of cinder blocks, a coil of garden hose, the corner where the light could not reach. I lit the lantern. I moved the wheelbarrow. I moved the cinder blocks. I moved the hose. I got down on my hands and knees with the lantern beside me, and I ran my palm across the cold concrete slowly, inch by inch. And there, 6 feet from the back wall, I found it. It was not a crack. It was a line, a perfectly straight, perfectly deliberate line cut into the concrete, forming a square about 4 feet on each side. The line was so fine that you could not see it unless you knew it was there. There was no handle. There was no ring. There was no visible hinge. It was a seam flush hidden in plain sight by the shadow of the stove. A trap door. I pressed on the seam. It did not move. I pressed harder. It did not move. I went and got a length of 2x4 from Buck's lumber pile against the wall, and I wedged it into the seam at one edge, and I leaned on it with my full weight. Something deep beneath the floor groaned. A counterweight. A pivot. The slab tilted up. A square of darkness opened in the foundation. Cold air rose out of it. The air smelled of stone and earth and old wood, and beneath those smells the dry, papery smell of a place where something had been preserved for a long time. I shined the lantern down into the hole. A ladder, made of iron rebar set into the stone wall of a shaft. Going down maybe 8 feet, I climbed down. At the bottom of the ladder, I stood in a small chamber. The walls were made of fieldstone fitted together without mortar, the way the stonemasons of the old country had fitted them, the way my grandfather had been taught to fit them by a man whose name I did not know. The chamber was perhaps 8 feet long and 6 feet wide and 7 feet high. The floor was flagstone. The air was dry. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, was a metal lockbox. Beside the lockbox was a glass mason jar. Inside the mason jar was a folded piece of paper sealed against the moisture. I picked up the jar. I unscrewed the lid. I unfolded the paper. My grandfather's handwriting again, the same neat carpenter's hand. If you found this child, you were paying attention. Good girl, I built the hut for what's under it. I built what's under it for you and your sister. The lockbox has what you need. I picked up the lockbox. It was heavy. There was no key, but the latch opened with a simple thumb press. I lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged, were 3 things. The first was a thick folder manila secured with a rubber band. The label on the folder read in my grandfather's hand, Geological Survey, Catskill Highlands, Aquifer Study Summers, 1991 to 1992, original copies. The second was a sealed envelope, smaller, addressed to me by name in the same hand. The third was an audio cassette in a plastic case with a white label on it. The label said in block printing, in faded blue ballpoint pen, for Della. Play only after folder. I sat down on the flagstone floor. I opened the folder. I read for the better part of an hour under the yellow light of the lantern, with my breath making small clouds in the cold cellar air. The folder contained the maps and the readings and the conclusions of a state geological survey that had been completed in 1992 and which had subsequently been classified at the state level, sealed against public release. The survey documented the discovery of a deep aquifer, one of the largest unbroken aquifers in the northeastern United States, running under the western Catskills. The aquifer was fed by snowmelt from the high ridges. It was protected by an upper layer of impermeable shale. The water was rated as exceptionally pure. The estimated yield, if tapped commercially, was in the tens of millions of gallons per day. The aquifer ran directly under Lot 7B, under the hut, under the cellar, under me. A second document in the folder prepared by my grandfather, many years later, around the time my grandmother had died, was a legal opinion from a water rights attorney in Albany dated 2009. The opinion concluded that the original deed for Lot 7B, drafted in 1957 by a surveyor who had not known what was beneath the surface, had not separated mineral and water rights from the surface estate. The water rights had remained attached to the deed. Whoever owned the deed owned the water. I closed the folder. I sat for a long time in the cold cellar. My grandfather had not left me a piece of dirt. My grandfather had left me a city. I reached for the cassette tape. There was an old tape recorder on the workbench up in the hut, the kind with the buttons that clunked. Buck had given it to me my second week here. He said his late wife had used it to record her sister's recipes and that he could not bear to throw it away, and I had set it on the bench and never used it. I climbed back up the ladder. I went to the workbench. I put the cassette in the recorder. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wood stove and the lantern beside me. I pressed play. There was a hiss, a long hiss, the sound of an old tape that had been waiting, and then my grandfather's voice. It was older than I remembered. It was tired. It was the voice of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time. Della, it said. I closed my eyes. If you are hearing this, child, then they have come for me, or they have come for you, or they have come for both of us. I am sorry. I am sorry for so many things. I am going to tell you a story, and the story will not be easy to hear, and you do not have to forgive me for it, but you do have to know it. You have to know it because the people who are coming for you will not tell you the truth, and you have to know the truth before you go to fight them." He paused. The tape hissed. "In the summer of 1992, I worked with a young man named Cyrus Pickering. We surveyed this ridge together. We found the water. We were the first men in 50 years to know it was there. Cyrus was my friend. He was the closest friend I ever had in this world. Your grandmother knew that and forgave it, and I will go to my grave grateful for her grace." His voice grew rougher. Cyrus had a family business in Albany. They were in real estate. They had been since the 1800s. Cyrus's father, old Mr. Pickering, had heard rumors of what we were finding. He pressed Cyrus to bring the data home. Cyrus refused at first, but the family was deep in the wrong kind of debt, and the father was a hard man, and by September, Cyrus had changed his mind. He told me one evening on the ridge that he was going to give the data to his father. He said his father would know how to monetize it. He said the family would buy up the land before the state could declare a watershed. He said we would both be rich men by Christmas. A long pause. I told him no, child. I told him that water that big, that pure, did not belong to one family. I told him it would be a sin against the people of this county to lock it up. He laughed at me. He said I was a fool. He said sin was a word for men too poor to afford a better one. The tape hissed. We argued. The argument grew hot. We were on a narrow part of the ridge, wet leaves underfoot. I pushed him, child. I pushed him with both hands hard in the chest. I did not mean to send him over. I swear to you on my mother's grave that I did not mean to. But he went over, and he fell, and he died on the rocks below, and I came down off that ridge a different man than I had been when I went up. I could not breathe. I told the sheriff it was an accident. I lied to the sheriff and to the inquest and to your grandmother and to my own face in the mirror for the rest of my life. I was a coward. I was a young man who could not face what he had done. I bought the parcel in 1993 with what was left of my survey pay. I bought it not because I wanted to be rich. I bought it because I could not live with the thought of the water falling into the hands of the men who had pushed Cyrus to take it from his friend. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a man who has practiced what he is saying for many years. I spent the rest of my life trying to atone, child. I built the hut. I built the cellar. I saved every dollar I could. I waited for old Mr. Pickering to die, and then I waited for his grief to pass into his grandson, and I knew the grandson would come. Roland came 3 years ago. He offered me money. He threatened me. I told him no. He said he would not forget the answer. A pause. He did not forget. I am, as I record this, beginning to make plans to tell what I know to a man at a newspaper. If something happens to me before I can speak with him, then you, child, are the only one who can finish what I started. You are stronger than I was. You have your mother's heart and your grandmother's chin, and you do not have my cowardice. I am sorry. I am leaving this for you. I had no one else to leave it to. A long silence. I love you, Della. Take care of your sister. Do not trust Roland Pickering. Do not trust his son, and do not let them tell you that I was only a victim. I was both. I was both. The tape clicked. The reels turned in silence for a few seconds, and then the player auto-stopped, and the small mechanical clunk of the stop button was the loudest sound in the hut. I sat in the dark for a long time. I did not weep. The thing I felt was bigger than weeping. I sat against the warm flank of the wood stove with my eyes open and my hands flat on the cold concrete. and I let my grandfather's voice settle into the rooms of my chest. He had not been a saint. I had built a saint in my head for 9 years, and the tape had taken him down off the wall, and what was left was a man who had made a terrible mistake in his youth, a man who had spent 33 years trying to make it right, a man who had died for me before I had ever asked him to. I do not know what time it was when I finally stood. The fire had burned down to coals. I fed it. I climbed the ladder back down into the cellar. I put the folder back in the lockbox. I put the lockbox back on the pedestal. I climbed back up. I closed the trap door. I dragged the cinder blocks and the wheelbarrow and the coiled hose back over it. I went outside. The night was clear. The Milky Way ran across the sky like a brushstroke. I stood on the cold ground and I looked up at the stars, and I said out loud to a man who had been in the ground for 9 years, "All right, Grandpa, all right." Then I went back inside and I slept. What happened next happened fast. It was a Wednesday in the last week of April. I had just come back from town, where I had spent an hour at Mr. Thackeray's office reviewing the contents of the lockbox with him, and he had said, only after he had read the geological survey for the second time, "Miss Hollister, I have been an attorney for 51 years, and I have never seen a document like this fall into the hands of a young woman it was meant for. Your grandfather was a great deal more than a carpenter." I had not known what to say. I had thanked him and left. I drove the Buick back up the county road. I parked it at the head of Old Miller Road, where I always parked it. I walked the half-mile up through the woods to the hut. Halfway up, I knew something was wrong. The clearing was too quiet. There were no birds. I came around the bend in the path, and I saw the doors. They were standing open. The padlock was on the ground. The hasp had been pried off the door frame with a crowbar. The wood around the screws was splintered, fresh splinters, pale wood under the rust. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. I listened. There was no sound from inside the hut. I went forward very slowly with my heart beating in my throat. I picked up a length of 2x4 from the wood pile beside the door because I had learned in 6 years at Northwood that a piece of pine is sometimes the best thing a girl can have in her hand. I stepped inside. The hut had been searched. Tools were on the floor. The workbench had been swept clean. The wood stove had been pulled away from the wall an inch or two. The floor beneath it scraped where they had checked for hollow spots. The pile of canvas tarps had been thrown into the corner. The cot was overturned, but the trap door was still closed. The cinder blocks were still on top of it. The wheelbarrow had not been moved. I stood in the wreckage and I looked at the corner where the light could not reach, and I understood that whoever had come had not known to look there. They had searched the obvious places. They had not searched the hidden one. I went outside. I followed the boot prints in the soft April mud. There were 2 sets, heavy, men, size 11, size 12. They had come up from a different direction, not along Old Miller Road, but down from the ridge to the north. They had parked somewhere on a logging cut. They had walked in over the high ground. They had been professional. I followed the prints to the edge of the trees. I stopped at the edge of the trees because something on the wind was not right. I turned around and I looked at the hut. A thin curl of smoke was rising from the back corner, not from the chimney, from the lean-to shed I had built 3 weeks earlier against the back wall, where I kept my chainsaw and my gas cans and my new generator. I started to run. By the time I got there, the shed was a wall of flame. The fire had taken everything. The chainsaw, the generator I had paid $400 for, the 2 5-gallon gas cans which had gone up like small bombs, and which had blown the back panel of the shed against the curve of the hut and scorched a black mark across the corrugated steel. I did not have water enough to fight it. I did not have a hose. I had only the buckets and the stream a quarter mile away, and a heart that was beating very, very hard. I let the shed burn. I stood 10 feet back with the heat on my face, and I watched the thing I had built burn to its frame, and I understood what the burning shed was meant to say. It was a message. It was the second message of the day. The first had been the broken doors. The two messages together said the same thing. We can come whenever we want. We can take whatever we want. We can burn whatever we want. Sign the papers, child. I let the shed burn down to a heap of black timber and twisted metal. The fire was a small one in the end, and the woods were still damp from the spring, and it did not spread. When the last of it had collapsed in on itself, and there was only smoke, I went into the hut. I sat on the cot which I had set right again. I put my hands flat on my knees. I made myself breathe. I picked up my coat. I went down the path to the Buick. I drove to town. I drove straight to the payphone outside the diner. I dialed the number for Northwood. The receptionist answered. "This is Della Hollister. I need to speak to my sister Junie. It's an emergency." There was a pause, a different kind of pause than the pauses I had grown used to. A wrong pause. "Miss Hollister," the receptionist said, "your sister is no longer at this facility." The world tilted. "What do you mean she's no longer at this facility?" "She was transferred this morning. Emergency transfer. By court order. I am not at liberty to discuss the destination." "Where did you send her?" "Miss Hollister, I am not at liberty." "Where did you send my sister?" The receptionist's voice was tight. She was not, I realized, enjoying this. Someone was standing over her, probably telling her what to say. "She has been transferred to a facility in the western part of the state. A temporary placement, pending a review of her case. I am not at liberty to share more." I hung up. I stood in the cold afternoon outside the diner with my hands still on the receiver, and I felt something in me go very, very quiet. The shed was the second message. This was the third. I walked back to the Buick. I got in. I closed the door. I sat with my hands on the wheel, and I looked through the windshield at the faded brick of the building across the street. A man was leaning against the side of the building. He was tall. He was thin. He wore a dark wool coat that was too well cut for Hollow Ridge, and he had a sharp jaw and a sharper smile, and there was a gold ring on his left hand that caught the sunlight. I had never met him. I knew him from the photograph. He was the grandson. He pushed himself off the wall. He crossed the street. He came around to the driver's side of the Buick. He bent down. He tapped one knuckle very politely on the glass. I rolled the window down 2 inches. "Miss Hollister," Trevor Pickering said, "I think it's time we had a conversation." He smiled the same smile his grandfather had smiled in the summer of 1992. "Sign the papers, child. Sign the papers, and your sister is home by tomorrow night." The long whisper came down off the ridge. It was not this time a comfort. It was a warning. I did not roll the window down any further. I looked at Trevor Pickering through 2 inches of glass, and I saw in that moment every fluorescent light in every long hallway I had ever walked. In 6 years of being a girl, no one came for. I saw Mrs. Talbot's tired clipboard. I saw the chicken wire baked into the window beside the door. I saw Junie's hand flat on the glass, and the way the fingers had spread out like a star, and the way she had not cried because Junie did not cry. I saw all of it. And then I saw something else. I saw the autumn of 1992. I saw a ridge with wet leaves on it. I saw a young man in a flannel shirt with a survey map in his pocket, pushing another young man with both hands hard in the chest because the other young man had laughed at him and called him a fool. I saw my grandfather come down off that ridge alone, and I saw him carry what he had done for 33 years, and I saw him sit in a workshop somewhere in the autumn of 2017 and pick up a telephone and dial a number for a man named Howard Massengill at the Albany Times-Union and say in a voice that must have been very tired, "I am ready." He had not been ready in the end. He had not lived long enough, but I had. I rolled the window the rest of the way up. I started the engine. Trevor Pickering took half a step back from the door. The smile did not leave his face. He spread his hands a little, as if to say, "Suit yourself." I drove. I drove straight to the office over the pharmacy. I went up the stairs 2 at a time. I went through Mr. Thackeray's door without knocking, and the old man looked up from a book on his desk, and he saw my face, and he set the book down and reached for the telephone before I had said a single word. "Buford," he said into the receiver. "It's begun?" "Yes." "Now?" "Yes." "Bring the sheriff." He set the receiver down. He came around the desk. He took me by both shoulders. His grip was light, but his eyes were not. "Tell me," he said. I told him. I told him about the broken doors. I told him about the burned shed. I told him about the receptionist at Northwood and the emergency transfer. I told him about the man on the sidewalk and the smile and the gold ring and the words "Sign the papers, child." I did not cry. I did not have any crying left. Mr. Thackeray listened, the way an old man listens when he has been waiting half his life for a young woman to walk through his door and say exactly what I was saying. He did not interrupt. He did not gasp. When I was done, he nodded once, very slowly, and he walked back around to his side of the desk, and he sat down, and he opened the top drawer, and he took out a yellow legal pad and a fountain pen. "Miss Hollister," he said, "we are going to make a list." He uncapped the pen. The first thing on the list is a telephone call to a woman in Albany named Margaret Stroud. She is the finest water rights attorney in this state. She owes me a favor that is 40 years old and has been waiting for a use. The second thing on the list is the entirety of the contents of your cellar photographed and notarized before sundown. The third thing on the list is the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation Regional Office, Albany Public Corruption Desk. I sat down across from him. "And the fourth," I said. He looked at me over his glasses. "The fourth, Miss Hollister, is your sister." The bell on the door rang. Buck came up the stairs. He was carrying a thermos and a brown paper sack and a Mossberg pump-action 12-gauge with a sling on it, and he set the thermos on the desk and the sack beside it, and he leaned the shotgun against the wall in the corner, the way a man leans a broom, without comment, without ceremony. Behind him in the doorway stood Sheriff Earl Hollenbeck. He was a big man. He filled the door. He wore a tan jacket over a brown uniform shirt, and his hat was in his hand, and his face was the face of a man who had been told just now on the street outside what had been happening on his watch. He looked at me. He looked at the floor. He looked at me again. "Miss Hollister," he said. His voice was hoarse. "My daddy was the sheriff who signed off on the inquest in October of '92. He took an envelope from old Mr. Pickering the week after he signed it. I found the envelope in his papers when he died. I did not know what to do with what I found. I am ashamed to tell you that I did nothing with it for too long. I am here to do something with it now. You tell me what you need. I am yours. I had not expected this. I had not expected any of this. Mr. Thackeray took the cap off his pen. Sit down, Sheriff. We are making a list. By midnight, the list had become a plan. By dawn, the plan had become a machine. Margaret Stroud drove down from Albany in a gray sedan that arrived at 6 in the morning. She was a small woman with short steel-colored hair and a brown wool coat and eyes that did not waste motion. She read the geological survey in the back office of Mr. Thackeray's firm at a long table in the light of a single green-shaded lamp, while Buck poured coffee and Mr. Thackeray watched her, and the sheriff stood by the window and looked out at the empty street below. She finished the survey. She set it down. She lined the pages up carefully. She said to no one in particular, "Sweet, merciful God." She turned to me. "Miss Hollister, do you understand what you have here?" "I think I do. I want to make certain. This survey, if it is authentic, and it appears to be documents the largest unsequestered private water reserve in the eastern seaboard, the legal opinion appended to it confirms that the water rights have never been separated from the surface estate. You are the surface owner. You own the water. All of it. Not a share, not a permit. The water." I did not say anything. "Summit Creek Estates is a shell," she said. "Behind it is a holding company. Behind the holding company is the Pickering Family Trust. They are not building a resort. They never were. They are buying a watershed. They intend to bottle this water and to sell it on the wholesale market within the decade. The valuation, if I read the documents correctly, would be in the low billions." She paused. "Your grandfather knew this, Miss Hollister. He sat on this land for 30 years to keep it out of their hands. And he died, I would wager, because he was about to make it public." She looked at the sheriff. "You will need a warrant. You will not get a warrant in this county. You will need to get one in Albany. I can have one in your hand by tomorrow afternoon. I want exhumation authorized. I want the medical examiner's office in Kingston to know that there will be a federal investigator on their doorstep before lunch." The sheriff nodded. He did not speak. He was, I think, listening to a thing inside himself that he had not heard in a long time. Margaret Stroud turned back to me. "And the sister," she said. "They moved her out west. They wouldn't tell me where." She took her phone out of her coat pocket. "I have a colleague at the State Office of Children and Family Services. She owes me 2 favors. We will spend one of them this morning. Your sister will be located by noon. She will not be transferred again. I will see to it personally." I did not know what to say. I did not say anything. Margaret Stroud looked at me for a moment. Her face was not warm. Her face was something better than warm. It was the face of a woman who had been waiting a long time to do something she had wanted to do and who had finally found the door. "Miss Hollister," she said, "your grandfather chose well." That afternoon we drove out to the hut. Buck rode in the truck with me. Sheriff Hollenbeck followed in his cruiser. Margaret Stroud followed in the gray sedan. A photographer from a firm in Kingston, hired through a friend of Mr. Thackeray's, followed in a hatchback with the equipment in the back. We made a small procession up the county road, and we turned onto Old Miller Road, and we parked at the head of the trail, and we walked up through the woods in single file. The hut was as I had left it. The burned shed was a black scar against the curve of the metal. The doors were still propped open from the day before. The wood stove was cold. I led them to the corner where the light could not reach. I moved the cinder blocks. I moved the wheelbarrow. I wedged the 2x4 into the seam, and I leaned on it, and the slab tilted up, and the square of darkness opened in the floor. The photographer took pictures. Margaret Stroud climbed down the ladder first. She came back up 20 minutes later with the lockbox under her arm and a look on her face that I would think about for the rest of my life. She set the box on the workbench. She opened it. She nodded at the photographer. The photographer took more pictures. Sheriff Hollenbeck stood by the workbench with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the contents of the box, and he said quietly to no one and to everyone, "Goddamn Silas. Goddamn." We took the lockbox back to town. We took the cassette and the date book. We took the photograph of two young men on a ridge in the summer of 1992. We took everything I had, and we drove it in 3 vehicles back to Mr. Thackeray's office, and we did not stop working that day until well after the street lights had come on. At 10:15 that night, Margaret Stroud's phone rang. She listened. She said, "Yes, thank you, yes, by morning." She hung up. She looked at me. "Your sister is in a county group home outside Buffalo. She is well. She does not know what is happening. We are sending a guardian ad litem to her tomorrow at 10. The hold on her transfer is in effect as of this minute. They will not move her again." I sat down. I had been standing. I sat down on the leather chair in front of Mr. Thackeray's desk, and I put my face in my hands, and the crying I thought I had used up came back, and I let it come, and no one in that room said anything until it was finished. Then Buck put a hand on my shoulder very lightly, the way he had put his hand on my shoulder in the back of the hardware store the day I had met him. "All right, child," he said, "let's go get her." The town came in slow, and then it came in fast. Buck started it. He sat at the counter of the diner the next morning, and he told 3 men what was happening, and those 3 men told 9. And by the end of that day, half of Hollow Ridge knew that the Pickering family had been buying up the Western Catskills, and that they had been responsible for at least one death that anyone could remember, and that an 18-year-old girl named Della Hollister was the only thing standing between a watershed the size of 3 counties and a private water bottling operation worth more money than any of them had ever seen. The town did not love me exactly. They did not know me yet, but they knew Silas Hollister. They knew Buck Rinaldi. They knew the smell of an outside concern trying to take something out of a hollow without asking permission, and they had smelled it a long time, and they were tired of it. A retired electrician named Cleon Bagshaw came up the trail to the hut on the second morning without being asked, with a roll of wire and a tool belt slung over his shoulder, and he wired the hut for proper power and refused to take $1 from me. A woman named Eulalie Strothers, who ran the post office, sent her 2 grown sons up with a backhoe and a load of crushed stone to grade the trail into something a truck could actually drive on. The pastor of the little church at the end of Main Street, a man whose name I will not write here because he asked me not to, came by Mr. Thackeray's office and said only, "When the time comes, child, you will not stand alone in any courtroom," and then he left without taking off his coat. I did not know what to do with any of it. I had spent 6 years being told in 100 small ways that I was alone. I did not know how to be in a town. I did not know how to be a person in a place. I learned slowly, day by day. Buck taught me. Mr. Thackeray taught me. The long whisper coming down off the ridge in the evenings taught me. The article came out on the 2nd Sunday of May. It was on the front page of the Albany Times-Union above the fold. Howard Massengill had written it 25 years after the meeting he had not been able to keep with my grandfather. The headline ran across 4 columns. "Pickering Empire and the Catskill Water," the headline said. "A quiet murder an older grief, and a granddaughter's fight. By Monday, the story had been picked up by the wire services. By Wednesday, the regional FBI office in Albany had executed a search warrant on the corporate headquarters of Summit Creek Estates and on the law offices of Trevor Pickering Esquire, and the medical examiner in Kingston had ordered an exhumation, and the body of Silas Hollister had been raised from the ground for the first time in 9 years, and a forensic pathologist from Syracuse had begun the slow work of looking again at what had happened to him. On the Friday of that same week, Mr. Thackeray's telephone rang. It rang at 9 in the morning. He picked it up. He listened. He did not speak. He hung up. "Miss Hollister," he said, "they have asked for a meeting here today, 2 o'clock. They are bringing terms." I looked at him. "Should I go?" "You should not only go, Miss Hollister. You should set the chair on your side of this desk where you want it. You should pour the coffee yourself, and you should remember that they have come to you. They have not come to me. They have not come to the sheriff. They have come to you because you are the surface owner, and they understand finally what that means." He paused. "Bring the cassette." They came at 2 o'clock exactly. Roland Pickering Sr. came up the stairs first. He was 65 years old, perhaps a year or two older. He was tall. He had the same sharp jaw as his son and the same gold ring on his left hand and a fine wool overcoat that he did not take off. His hair was iron-colored. His eyes were the color of weak coffee. He moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who had been making other people wait for so long that the waiting had become part of his body. Trevor Pickering followed his father. He did not smile this time. A third man came up behind them, a lawyer from a firm in Manhattan, whose name I never learned and have never wanted to learn. He carried a briefcase. He sat at the end of the table without speaking. Mr. Thackeray was at his desk. Margaret Stroud was at the desk beside him. I was in the chair I had set myself by the window which faced the door. Buck was downstairs in the pharmacy drinking coffee because Mr. Thackeray had said it would be better if he were not in the room, and Buck had understood and had not argued, but had also not gone home. The cassette player was on the desk in front of me. The cassette was inside it, cued to the beginning. Roland Pickering did not sit down. He looked at me and only at me, and he said, "Miss Hollister, we have come to make this go away. We have authorization to offer $1 million for the deed to Lot 7B, all rights attached free and clear. We will fund a separate trust for your sister in an additional sum of $100,000. We will withdraw all pending offers and threats. We will, in addition, decline to pursue any legal action regarding the slanderous content of the newspaper article that appeared this past Sunday." He stopped. "This offer is good until the close of business today. Then it is gone." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I reached out and I pressed the play button on the cassette. The hiss filled the office. The hiss was the longest sound I have ever heard. And then my grandfather's voice came out of the small speaker, tired and steady, the voice of a man who had carried something for 33 years and was finally setting it down. "Della," the voice said, "if you are hearing this, child, then they have come for me, or they have come for you, or they have come for both of us." I watched Roland Pickering's face. I watched the color leave it. I watched the eyes drop, then rise, then go somewhere far away. I watched his hand find the back of the chair beside him and hold it very lightly, the way a man holds the rail of a ship in heavy seas. The voice spoke. We argued. The argument grew hot. We were on a narrow part of the ridge, wet leaves underfoot. I pushed him, child. I pushed him with both hands hard in the chest. I did not mean to send him over. Roland's mouth opened. He did not speak. His mouth simply opened, the way a child's mouth opens when a thing has surprised it past words. The voice spoke on. I bought the parcel in 1993 with what was left of my survey pay. I bought it not because I wanted to be rich. I bought it because I could not live with the thought of the water falling into the hands of the men who had pushed Cyrus to take it from his friend. I let the tape run to the end. When the tape clicked off, the office was very still. Roland Pickering sat down finally in the chair he had been holding. He set both hands flat on the table. He looked at the table, not at me. When he spoke, his voice was not the voice he had walked in with. You think your grandfather was a saint, Miss Hollister? No, sir, I said. I don't. He looked up. My father told me when I was 11 years old that Silas Hollister had murdered his brother. That was the word he used. Murdered. He told me on the morning of the funeral. He took me out behind the church in Albany, and he sat me down on the steps of the rectory, and he told me. He said that man took my brother, and the state took my brother, and one day, son, you will take what is theirs. He paused. My father was not a man who lied to me. I lived my life on the back of that morning. I built this company on the back of that morning. I believed until exactly 1 minute ago that I was avenging a brother my father had loved more than he loved me. He looked at the cassette. You have just told me that my father did not lie, and you have also told me, in the same breath, that he did not tell me the whole truth. He did not tell me that my Uncle Cyrus had been planning to sell the survey to the family. He did not tell me that my grandfather had pressured him. He did not tell me that my uncle had laughed at his friend and called him a fool. He told me only that he had been killed. He laughed. The laugh was not a good sound. My God, my God, my God. Mr. Thackeray, who had been silent, spoke. Mr. Pickering, you are not, I am afraid, the only one among us who has been deceived by a family. You are, however, the only one in this room who has had his uncle killed in 1992 and who has had his uncle's killer killed in 2017. That second death is not in dispute. The exhumation is complete. The pathologist's preliminary report is on its way to Albany this afternoon. The cause of death will not be a stroke. Imausud. Roland Pickering looked at Mr. Thackeray. He did not deny it. He simply looked. Then he looked back at me. What do you want, Miss Hollister? I had been thinking about that question for 2 weeks. I had thought about it on the walk up Old Miller Road and on the walk back down. I had thought about it while I split kindling and while I hauled water and while I drank coffee at Buck's counter and while I listened to the long whisper come down off the ridge. I had thought about what my grandfather would have wanted. I had thought about what my mother would have wanted. I had thought about what I would have to live with when I was an old woman with sawdust on my own sleeves. I leaned forward in my chair. I am not selling the land, I said. I am not selling the water. The land was bought with my grandfather's atonement, and the water was kept because no one family deserves to own it. I will lease you the right to draw a fixed quantity, no more on terms that I and Mrs. Stroud will set. The bulk of the water will be placed in a public trust, administered by the Township of Hollow Ridge and 3 neighboring municipalities, with priority access at reduced rates for the residents of this county in perpetuity. I paused. In exchange for the lease, you will fund the trust at the level Mrs. Stroud will specify. You will withdraw all pending litigation and threats. You will dissolve Summit Creek Estates and any other shell entity active in this county. And you will, Mr. Pickering, do one more thing. I looked at him. You will commission a stone marker to be placed in the town square of Hollow Ridge, naming both Cyrus Pickering and Silas Hollister. The marker will state in plain language that two young men who had been friends quarreled on a ridge in October of 1992 over the future of the water beneath them, and that one of them died, and that the other carried the cost of it for the rest of his life, and that the families of both men have agreed on the second Sunday of May in the year of our Lord 2026 to lay down the grief that has been passed between them like an inheritance. I sat back. That is what I want. Roland Pickering looked at me for a very long time. I could not read his face. I do not know what I would have read if I had been able to read it. I have thought about that look in the years since. I have decided finally that what was in his face was not anger or grief or even regret, but something older than any of those. The look a man has when a door he has been pushing against all his life turns out to have been unlocked the whole time. He stood up. He did not offer his hand. I did not offer mine. We did not shake. He nodded once very slowly. Mrs. Stroud will have papers to me by Friday, he said. I will sign them. He turned to go. At the door he paused. He did not look back. He should not have lied to me, he said to no one in particular. My father should not have lied to me. Then he was gone. Trevor followed him. The Manhattan lawyer followed Trevor. The door at the bottom of the stairs closed. The federal indictment came down on Roland Pickering Sr. on the 2nd day of June. He was charged with the murder of Silas Hollister by means of a substance introduced into a meal on the evening of October 10th, 2017, by a man named Hollister, had welcomed into his workshop, believing him to be a buyer for a piece of furniture. The man had been a contractor of Roland Pickering's. The man had taken a plea deal in early May. Roland was charged with conspiracy, with murder for hire, with a string of lesser corruption stretching back 9 years. He did not contest most of it. Trevor was disbarred. Their company was dissolved by court order. The signing of the lease and the deed for the trust took place in a conference room at Margaret Stroud's office in Albany on the last day of June. I wore a dress I had bought at the dry goods store in Hollow Ridge with $100 out of one of the jars. It was the first dress I had owned in 3 years. I signed my name on 26 pages. Margaret Stroud signed beside me. Mr. Thackeray signed as witness. Buck Rinaldi signed as a director of the new public trust, along with the mayor of Hollow Ridge and the supervisors of 3 neighboring townships. When we were done, Margaret Stroud capped her pen and she set it down on the table, and she looked at me and she said, Miss Hollister, you have just signed away approximately $600 million in private profit. I thought about that for a second. No, ma'am, I said. I just signed it back to where it belongs. She smiled. It was a small smile. It was a real one. Your grandfather, she said, would have liked you very much. The petition for guardianship was heard on the 3rd Tuesday of July. The courtroom was in a brick building in the county seat. The judge was a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, not unlike the one the county clerk in Kingston had worn. She read my file. She looked over the rim of her glasses at the gallery. The gallery was full. Mr. Thackeray was in the front row. Buck Rinaldi was beside him. Margaret Stroud had come down from Albany. Sheriff Hollenbeck was in uniform in the 2nd row with his hat on his knee. Cleon Bagshaw, the electrician, was there with his wife. Eulalie Strothers from the post office. the pastor of the little church with the bell that no longer rang, a woman who had brought me a box of canning jars in late April and had refused to give her name, the man who ran the propane company, the owner of the feed store, the owner of the diner, 16 or 17 people in all from a town of 900 who had taken a Tuesday morning off work to drive an hour and sit in a courtroom for a girl they had known for less than 5 months. The judge looked at the file. She looked at the room. She looked at Junie, who sat in the chair beside the social worker in a blue dress with her hair brushed and her brown eyes very wide. Miss Hollister, the judge said, "This petition is granted. Your sister will be released into your custody at the close of these proceedings. The court wishes you both well." She tapped the gavel. It was a small sound, the sound of an account being opened. Junie came across the courtroom to me slowly at first, and then faster, and at the last she was running, and she ran into me hard enough to make me step back, and she put her face into the front of my coat, and she stayed there for a long time, and I put one hand on the back of her head and the other on her shoulder, and I did not say anything because there was nothing in any language that could have said it. We drove home in Mr. Thackeray's Buick. Junie sat in the front seat. She was 12 years old and small for her age, and her feet did not quite touch the floor. She did not speak for the first half hour. She looked out the window at the mountains and the trees and the late summer sky, and her eyes were big and quiet. When we turned onto the county road that leads to Hollow Ridge, she finally spoke. "Della." "Yes, Junebug." "Where are we going?" "Home." "Is it far?" "Not anymore." She thought about that. "Does it have a roof?" I almost laughed. I almost cried again. I did neither. "Yes, Junebug, it has a roof." When we came up Old Miller Road, the trail had been graded smooth by Eulalie Strother's boys, and the Buick took it without complaint, and we came up out of the trees into the clearing in the long gold light of a July evening. Junie sat very still in the passenger seat. She did not say anything for a long moment. The hut was no longer a hut. The rust was still there in patches along the lower curve because I had decided to leave some of it. The rust was part of the story, but there were new windows now, real ones, 6 of them, along each side, framed by Buck and glazed by his nephew. There was a real door at the front, set into a new wall. I had framed myself with a porch that ran the length of the south wall. The porch had 2 rocking chairs on it, and a small table between them, and a coffee can with wildflowers in it. The stovepipe rose straight and true through a properly flashed roof patch. Smoke was coming out of it because I had lit the stove that morning before driving down to the courthouse. The clearing had been mowed. The stone walls along the property line had been reset. A new shed, framed and roofed and sided in pine, stood where the burned one had been, with the chainsaw and the generator inside it. A small kitchen garden fenced against the deer ran along the east side of the hut. Tomatoes, beans, squash. Down at the far edge of the clearing, where the trail came up out of the trees, there was a wooden sign on a post. The sign said in lettering I had carved myself, slowly, badly, lovingly, with a chisel Buck had given me as a present in June Hollister. Home. Junie looked at the sign. She looked at the hut. She looked at me. "Della," she said. "Yes, Junebug. This isn't a hut. This is a house." "No, Junebug," I said. "It's not a hut, and it's not a house. It's a home." She got out of the Buick. She walked across the grass very slowly, the way a person walks into a place she has dreamed about. She climbed up the steps of the porch. She put her hand on the rail. She turned around and looked back at me. I came up the steps behind her. I put my arm around her shoulders. We stood there together and we looked out over the clearing and the stone walls and the woods rolling away to the west, and the long whisper came down off the ridge, and it was this time the sound it had been on my very first night in the hut, only now it did not feel like a warning. Now it felt like welcome. "Grandpa built this," Junie said. "He started it," I said. "We finished it." We stood on the porch for a long time. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I will be done. In the autumn of that year, on a Sunday in October, the town of Hollow Ridge dedicated a stone marker in the small grassy square between the diner and the church with the bell that did not ring. The marker was carved from a piece of bluestone quarried in the valley below. It stood about waist high. It had 2 names on it: Cyrus Pickering, 1967 to 1992, Silas Hollister, 1965 to 2017. Below the names in smaller letters were the words I had spoken in Mr. Thackeray's office on a Friday in May, almost word for word, because the families of both men had agreed on the language together after a long meeting in the back room of Buck's hardware store, and Roland Pickering Sr. had attended that meeting by video link from a federal facility in upstate New York, and he had wept once briefly and said only that the words were right. 2 young men who had been friends quarreled on a ridge in October of 1992 over the future of the water beneath them. One of them died. The other carried the cost of it for the rest of his life. The families of both men have laid down on the stone the grief that was passed between them like an inheritance. May the water below us run pure, may the children above us grow free, and may no man among us ever again forget that the work of repair is the work of generations. I read those words at the dedication. The wind that came down off the ridge that day was the long whisper, and it carried my voice out over the small crowd in the square and out past the diner and the church and up the county road and up Old Miller Road and through the open windows of the home I had built on the rusted bones of a hut my grandfather had set down in the middle of the Catskills 33 years before I had been old enough to know what he had done. Junie was beside me at the dedication. She was 13 by then. She had grown 2 inches over the summer. She had a school of her own and friends with names like Lila and Mary Beth, and a teacher who said she had a head for numbers. She was going to be all right. That was the only sentence I needed in the end. She was going to be all right. I want to say one more thing to you, the man or woman listening to this story. My grandfather was not a saint. He made a terrible mistake when he was a young man on a wet ridge in October of 1992, and that mistake cost a friend his life, and it cost my grandfather 33 years of his own life carried every day in a place inside himself where he could not put it down. He did not earn his way out of that mistake. A man does not earn his way out of a death, but he did something else. He turned the mistake into a foundation. He laid a slab of concrete over it, and he built a hut on top of the slab, and he saved every dollar he could, and he waited for a granddaughter he barely knew to grow old enough to inherit not the money and not the land, but the work of repair. The work of repair is the only work that matters in the end. If you have a mistake in your past that you cannot put down, I want you to know that the mistake is not the end of your story. The mistake is the foundation. Everything begins with the foundation. The man who built you may have built you out of his own quiet shame. The girl you raised may inherit your atonement before she inherits anything else. The work you did with your hands on a Sunday afternoon in a workshop somewhere when you thought no one was watching, may be the very thing that saves a child you have not yet met. My grandfather, Silas Hollister, taught me this without ever saying it out loud from a place where he could no longer say anything out loud. He taught me that the most valuable things are often hidden under layers of rust and neglect. He taught me that a home is not something you find. It is something you build with your own two hands on a foundation of love and stubbornness. And sometimes the love and the stubbornness are the same thing, and sometimes they are different things, and either way, the building goes on. He taught me that the greatest act of love is sometimes to leave behind a puzzle. You know the person you love is strong enough to solve. I solved his puzzle. I am sitting on the porch of the home I built on the foundation he poured on the land he bought with his atonement, and I am watching the long whisper come down off the ridge in the last hour before dark. Junie is inside. She is doing her homework at the kitchen table. The wood stove is ticking. The smell of cedar and wood smoke is on the air. I am 18 years old, and I am 28 years old, and I am every age I will ever be all at once, the way a person becomes every age she will ever be in the moment she comes finally home. This is my story. This is my grandfather's story. This, in the end, is your story too, if you will have it. Welcome home.